Thank you very much, Sabine, for the kind introduction, and welcome everybody. Good morning to this webinar. It's a great pleasure for me to walk you through the results of the task force work over the last year and present to you the findings and recommendations that have been published in December. I will basically hear me. I had a few issues internally with firewalls, but you tell me, Sabine, if something is breaking off. Otherwise, I will just continue.
Just one comment, Andreas. Maybe you could leave the mouse aside so it's not on the slide the whole time.
Okay, do that. So basically, in terms of content, I will provide you with a bit more background information on where we're coming from, where the initiative was basically, and provide you with an overview of what the involved stakeholders are. Then we can go through basically the recommended disclosures, explain the guidance notes associated to that. And I would like to go into specific features such as the scenario analysis, which I will explain in detail, and then basically explain next steps, how this will be implemented, what the effect could be in the financial market, and what the FSB's view is on how this should progress going forward. With that, I will also, Sabine will send this slide deck to you as well, so that you have all the detailed information, so you don't have to take any notes. So let me start with the background. Basically, the discussion started in a G20 context, and under the chairmanship of UK of the Green Finance Study Group. As part of this discussion, Mark Carney was basically mandated to assess whether climate change could potentially have a systemic impact on the financial market, whether risks and opportunities associated to climate change are already reflected in current reportings. And Mark Carney, as a chair of the Bank of England and as a regulator, in that context, conducted or initiated the research which was conducted by the Cambridge University. And based on these results, he held a number of public speeches on this topic. Based on the research and based on his analysis, he came to the conclusion that climate change, in fact, holds elements of systemic issues that he sees links that a combination of a lack of disclosure of related risks and opportunities could lead to wider impacts on the economy that are currently not reflected in the pricing on stock markets. And he therefore suggested that he would establish a task force that is mandated to develop such disclosure requirements to address these potential systemic issues. So the task and the mandate was basically related to three problems. One was that issues who generally have an obligation on the law, to disclose any material risks, that they basically lack the framework to do so for climate-related risks in all current disclosure requirements, be it under SEC or similar ones, and this mandate was missing. Similarly, for lenders or investors, insurers, they lacked the information. They couldn't really incorporate that into their daily business decisions, into investment, but insurance or insurance underwriting processes. And the regulators and the public sector, if you want, also lacked the understanding to what extent climate risks and opportunities would constitute a systemic issue in the economy. To address that, the task was basically to provide a more clear view and come up with recommendations that would address these pain points. maybe a few features of these recommendations that came out. So what's important to understand is that in principle they apply to all companies, but mainly obviously to they will apply to stock listed companies. The expectation is that these recommendations would be addressed and integrated into the financial filings of a company. So it's also a push for integrated reporting of sustainability risks and opportunities. They are designed in a way that they're linked to decision useful information. So there's really a strong link on impacts on companies. And on risks and opportunities. So this should be kept in mind. It's really the goal to make sure that we find more material information that need to be incorporated into financial decision making. The guidelines will also incorporate an element of forward-looking risk analysis, so the scenario analysis, and companies are basically encouraged to develop such views, develop such scenarios, and integrate that into their response to the guidelines. I can tell you more about that later. In addition, the report includes additional guidance when it comes to certain sectors and industries, and explains how exactly that should be integrated in the reporting. Most importantly, the guidelines are aimed to disclose both risks and opportunities. So it's not only a risk framework, it should really provide information that give a comprehensive overview about the positive and negative impacts on a company, and balance both and disclose these information. The nature of risks that have been considered and in the task force are outlined here, high level. You'll find more information on that in the actual report, but obviously each of those dimensions apply in different ways to a specific company. So it will be a company's task and duty basically to assess these risks in more detail, determine the materiality of those risks, and then conduct additional assessments to find out and find out the associated specific company risks and opportunities. I will go to the recommendations. Recommendations cover 4 dimensions. One dimension is linked to governance. So an organization would be asked to explain how exactly they handle climate-related risks and opportunities internally, what the approval process and schedule and the decision process looks like. Then we would have a strategy section where we will basically be asked to disclose the outcome of our internal assessment, give an overview about the risks and opportunities, including a forward-looking element linked to scenario assessments. Then the third dimension would be basically a risk management view on how the process looks like, or more description, rather boilerplate in my view, a description of how a company assesses risks in general, what kind of processes are in place. And then the last one is basically a section about specific metrics and targets. There are general expectations when it comes to metrics and targets to ensure that information can be aggregated, that it can be compared across companies within the sector, but also across sectors. And for that reason, there are supplemental guides for specific sectors with very specific elements and metrics that are suggested to be followed. So this is basically the heart piece of the report. It gives an overview about the recommendations on top. So the governance strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets recommendation. And below that, you'll see general recommended disclosures that apply to all sectors. Most notable, I would say, is the element on the strategy C, also describe the potential impact of different scenarios, including a 2-degree scenario on the organization businesses, strategy, and financial planning. This is a very new feature that as such is not really part of disclosure requirements currently. It's forward-looking, so there's an element that is totally new in this context. Skip those. I'll say a few more words about the actual structure of the report. So the recommendations, which I just showed, they apply to all sectors. They include also recommended disclosures, as I showed. And then you have an appendix, basically, with additional guidance for all sectors and supplemental guidance for certain specific sectors. You also find more info in this slide deck, which I will share with you. And maybe we can go through Q&A through some of those aspects and go through more details. When you look per sector who is covered by these supplemental guidance, you see basically it's both the financial sector and the non-financial sectors. We did focus on banks, insurance companies, asset owners, and asset managers. Maybe important information for insurance companies is that the insurance companies supplemental guidance actually applies to the liability side of the balance sheet, so our insurance and reinsurance activities, and the asset owners part applies to our investment activities. So as an insurance company, you would have to consider both supplemental guidances. For banks and asset managers, it's more straightforward. This brings me to the actual new element, and I think the most challenging element when it comes to fulfilling these criteria, which is the scenario analysis. We had long discussions about that element. This is basically the key piece that would address what's currently missing, namely this long-term view on climate-related risks and opportunities and the disclosure of these facts. The recommendation for most investors is linked basically to a 2-degree scenario, so that we would assess physical risks and transition risks associated to this transition to a low carbon economy aligned with the Paris Agreement. For insurance companies, an additional element would be that we should also look into more unmitigated transition in case regulation it becomes less effective. So we will be asked to assess basically also the impact of say a 4 degrees scenario, IPCC scenario on our weather book. But for most companies, I think it's sufficient if you assess the impact of a 2-degree scenario. You'll find a lot of additional technical guidance on that in the appendix of the report. This gives an overview about scenarios that can be applied, that are available, depending on a company's business. Certain scenarios may be more useful than others, but I think that should give enough information to get this assessment started. It's certainly not the expectation that companies would come out on day one or in the first reporting after the final release with a fully fledged perfect scenario assessment. So any qualitative first step into that direction, any first direct assessments of direct impacts of certain scenarios is certainly sufficient. So it's definitely acknowledged that this is a journey and that these efforts and these methods need to be developed going forward. But ultimately, the expectation is that the disclosure of related information is improving over time, and that methodologies will be more and more aligned going forward. Maybe a feature of scenario analysis in general, and an important aspect in my view is to recognize that this is not about assessing the likelihood of the future events to come. So don't get entangled in defining exactly what's likely and what's less likely, probable to happen. Scenario analysis in general should provide an overview and a range of possible outcomes. Very important there is to define your assumptions and to explain the assumptions, and basically then assess the impacts under these assumptions on your company, positive and negative ones. But it's not about, defining exact outcomes and quantifying the exact outcomes and the associated likelihoods. It should provide a range of possible outcomes and should help inform internal response to minimize related risks or to maximize potential opportunities associated to certain expectations and decisions. Maybe one word to similar report initiatives. I think most initiatives that have been assessed by the task force, we looked into some 300 or 350 reporting schemes globally, is that these disclosure requirements look into the impacts on companies and ask companies to disclose basically the risks for that company and opportunities, whereas many of the disclosure requirements currently existing, they have the view that companies should explain to what extent they're contributing events or contributing to adaptation against climate change. So it's from that perspective a change of view, a change of perspective, and this element should make it actually should make sure that we're identifying the risks which are relevant in an investment context. What's currently happening is that we are in a public consultation phase. So the report has been published in December, and we are asked to provide feedback, to raise concerns. These concerns will be addressed and most likely will be translated into additional guidance if needed. If more material aspects will be fed back, then we need to decide whether that has an effect the actual currently proposed recommendations. Based on the extensive discussions and an industry-led task force that included 35 major big companies, global companies, and the fact that we had a lot of outreach events globally, makes it rather unlikely that the actual recommendations will change fundamentally. So I think we can assume that this is quite stable. What will be addressed and translated into guidelines is probably more final, more minor. But the final say will be, or the final decision then after the actual condition phase. My view, or the task force view, is that the actual recommendations are quite stable. Ultimately, the final report will be published in June and will be presented in July to the G20 summit. So that's basically the formal plan until the release of the final report. So what's the expectation when it comes to adoption? I'm often asked, to what extent this is a voluntary initiative and how this will be adopted in the market and lead to a market standard. It's certainly important to notice that this is a fully voluntary initiative. It's an industry-led task force that came up with voluntary recommendations. But having said that, the companies involved in the initiative, which controls some 3 trillion assets under management and have links to some 20 trillion assets under management globally, they all confirmed that they will adopt these guidelines. So just that decision alone, I think, gives this standard quite a bit of weight. In addition, they're designed in a way that they also address regulatory expectations, and they are also pushed, out of an FSB context and out of a G20 context. So it's certainly important to recognize that this is a push and an initiative that comes from the public sector and is supported by that. To what extent it will be adopted as regulation at one point remains to be seen, but there's certainly a great interest of regulators in general in these disclosure requirements. So the journey, as outlined here on these expectations of FSB and the TCFD, is that the leading companies or those involved in the task force would start disclosing their material, their information, that based on these disclosure, many organizations, aggregators, asset managers, but also NGO will come up with further recommendations or criticism, and that we would see basically a refinement over time of the methods applied and of the data that gets published. With that refinement and consolidations of method, we would also see a greater adoption, further development of these standards, and ultimately the hope is that this would lead to the leading climate-related disclosure method and framework adopted widely across the globe. Obviously, regional views on such initiatives. So it was a deliberate act to actually make that a voluntary guidance note, also to ensure that adoption, for instance, in will be higher, greater, and also the guidelines are phrased in a way that they provide enough room to maneuver to accommodate specific legal concerns in certain jurisdictions, certain regions. And that should also help basically companies to align themselves with this framework, to learn over time and gradually improve the disclosures, make them more granular over time. But clearly it's a voluntary initiative, but has a lot of weight at the moment. In the supplemental guidance for financial sector and non-financials, maybe I just go very quickly through some of those. Difficulties to search slides, sorry. So on the banking side, it's basically about assessing impact of physical transition risks, climate-related risks on the lending and other financial intermediary business activities. And you see basically that distinction between industry, geography, credit and leverage tenor and so on would be appreciated. For insurance companies, one specific metric that has been defined is that we are asked to disclose our annual aggregated expected losses from weather-related catastrophes. That's an element and a data point, I think, which most, at least internationally operating companies are preparing anyway. It's part also of the information request of rating agencies. So the information is available and we should be able to disclose those. For asset owners, one particular feature or metric is that we're asked to disclose basically the carbon footprint of our investments. It's phrased in a way that we should disclose the carbon intensity of our investments. This is an element which is not directly reflecting a risk metric. So we had quite controversial discussions about that, but I think it does act as a proxy for a number of possible risks and opportunities. And there was a strong push also from FSB to integrate something like that to make sure that this kind of information gets published and can be reviewed and assessed also by public sector stakeholders. Same for asset managers. They also asked to publish in Appendix B, you'll find the specific disclosure requirements that apply for non-financials. I will not go through that in full detail, but you will receive this information summarized in this slide deck as well. With that, I would conclude my quick overview and rundown of the key features of the report, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and answering those. That's how you plan it, Sabine.
Okay, thank you very much, Andreas, for this interesting input on the TCFD report. I think it really helped our audience to better understand the objective of it and the content. Now, before we hand in some questions from the audience, questions and comments that we have received, let me pose you some questions from my side. One relates to the relation between CDP and TCFD. Many of our members have reported on climate change risks through CDP for quite some years. We all know this questionnaire has quite a strong focus on past emissions, mainly Scope 1 and 2. It increasingly added the perspective of the full value chain by asking for Scope 3 data, but nevertheless it is perceived as a more backward-looking tool. Where do you see the most important innovation of the TCFD report as compared to the reporting framework of CDP?
We've looked basically what CDP does and other disclosure requirements. I think the most important difference as such is basically this forward-looking risk element, the scenario part that goes beyond of what's currently covered by CDP. In addition, CDP is asking for a lot of granular data that not all of that is actually necessary to fulfill the CFD guidelines. So the expectation in general would be that many of those privately developed disclosure standards would align going forward also with the TCFD, that we would see over time a convergence of these standards and align based on the data that gets released ultimately. But for sometimes I would still expect that it's valid to consider both standards. A lot of the material that you have to prepare for CDP can be used one-to-one also to fulfill TCFD requirements, but it's not going to be sufficient. So you also need to think about additional forward-looking risk elements and opportunity elements that are not currently covered in CDP. But yeah, in the journey towards a consolidated global disclosure framework, the expectation is that all these currently available standards would converge over time.
Okay, so no need to fear that every financial service company has to fill in 5 different schemes in the end. You think there will be a convergence. Just an additional question on the scenario analysis. You mentioned that this was the important innovation and the forward-looking part of the recommendations. The report stays quite moderate as to the adoption of this scenario analysis in the reporting, and it really principally just recommends or says it's sufficient to report on one scenario, the 2-degree scenario. I mean, if we talk about scenarios, inherently we talk about different ways of how the future could develop. Wouldn't it make sense that TCFD was a bit more challenging here and asking reporters to also include different scenarios, except, for example, the 3 or even a 4-degree scenario on top?
Yes, well, the recommendations basically ask to assess at least a 2-degree scenario. The 2-degree scenario is basically what has been agreed as part of the Paris Agreement. So we have a global political decision, for that. And it's important for most of the investors and also the public stakeholders to understand what the transition risks and opportunities actually are, to anticipate what needs to be addressed by possibly also policies, additional policies, national policies, and regulation, and also to see to what extent, you know, the planned NDCs, so the country contributions, would affect the markets. So to close that feedback loop between the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the impacts on the economic side back to the policymakers, I think this element is very important. Having said that, it's probably not sufficient for many companies, particularly for insurance companies. One scenario that certainly needs to be also looked into is a more a higher degree warming scenario, a rather unmitigated scenario. The current discussions about the Paris Agreement and what the US is going to do, and the Trump administration, how they view the Paris Agreement. So there's a lot of uncertainty to what extent and to what degree the Paris Agreement will be implemented. So addressing that element of uncertainty certainly makes a lot of sense, and just at least having these two scenarios, a high degree scenario and low degree scenarios, would give a range of possible outcomes and disclose any material related issues. But there's a lot of room to maneuver and to decide on that. So when you define the material aspects, when you define the actual scenarios you want to follow through, you have a lot of freedom, but make sure that you at least assess the 2 degrees scenario impact. That makes it possible to compare, you know, the results across industries.
Okay, so room for development on the side of reporters there, starting with a 2 degree scenario and then maybe going into more options. We've now added some comments and questions from the audience, and I would like to start with a comment by John Moorhead. He pointed out that we already know quite a lot about today's CO2 emissions, the gap, the existing gap of the total emissions allowed to stay within the 1.5 or 2 degree scenario, and we also know the decrease rate. So principally, we have a lot of data available. He says, wouldn't it make sense to actually ask companies to report relative to this reduction path? What's your opinion on this, Andreas? You see it in the main chat on the bottom screen.
That's what you essentially ask to, right? You have to link the 2 degree scenario to this reduction path, to this expected reduction path, and assess what the impact would be. We didn't specify the exact features that are relevant. So for some companies, it may be that the reduction of CO2 that matters most. For others, it's more a reference scenario that would inform them about the impact on the energy sectors and the growth potential of certain sectors. So that there's a lot of room for imitation, also from an economic perspective, on how you translate that. But certainly, from an insurance perspective, from a weather insurance perspective, what matters is the emission reduction rates and the translation of those rates to temperature increases and links to the frequency and severity of certain events happening. That should be basically the assessments for the more physical risk scenarios. Okay. But again, a lot of freedom for interpretation.
And just as a comment here, John Moorhead, alongside with Tim Nixon and UNEP, have published data on this existing gap and also, well, on the decrease rate needed to actually reach the 1.5 and 2 degree scenario. So we'll be happy to include a link to this report in our email that we will send out after this webinar. Thank you, John, if you can send us the respective link and we'll share it with the participants. Another question from Markus Ott. It's also around the 2 degree benchmark. He principally asks, in the context of scenario analysis, would be your opinion on developing a 2-degree benchmark for investments, which allows the comparison of CO2 intensities based on the sectoral decarbonization approach by the Science-Based Targets Initiative? So it's a similar question, but goes sort of one level down, saying shouldn't the Science-Based Targets Initiative data be used to make this path more tangible, and then build on that to sort of create a benchmark to measure investments? Any comments on this, Andreas?
Yes, I see. Certainly, I see where Marcus is coming from, and it's also subject of detailed discussions in the task force. Ideally, if we had a benchmark and an index, we could basically measure the gaps that index. But then again, the views among the task force was quite diverse on risks actually are, to what extent certain sectors would become assets, to what extent we would see more disruptive or more gradual changes. And to be very honest and transparent, I think on what exactly is going to happen, I came to the conclusion that this shouldn't be really the task of the task force. It's actually a company decision to potential future impacts and disclose their views, and based on that, if we see a convergence of views, then in a second step such indices or such benchmarks could be developed, and that would then basically help to get more aligned on this. But at this point in time, I think the views differ too much. We could agree on a more specific, more prescriptive approach. I think in general, we try to be not prescriptive, also to ease the burden for companies and push the adoption rate as well. But on the journey, I think that's definitely the direction that we should try to follow.
Mm-hmm. This brings me to another question from my side. Or we see in the last slide of the appendix, you see the composition of the task force. It was actually quite varied regarding background, region, and type of organization. I'm sure there were quite different opinions in the group on what the recommendations should look like. Could you, without stating who opted for what, maybe give us some insights or examples of topics on the debate? In which areas was it most difficult to find a compromise and come to this recommendation?
Yeah, well, like always in such an exercise, a global exercise, and covering all these sectors, you start to realize that it's really hard to come up with KPIs, metrics, that are relevant in this context, which reflect certain risks for a whole sector. We did realize in the discussion that the circumstances of a specific company operating in a specific environment differs just way too much, and it was impossible to come up with very strict prescriptive key metrics that would allow aggregation and comparison across industries or even across companies in a certain industry. Just to make an example, if you take mining and the risks of water shortages caused by climate change, just that coming to a conclusion on how you actually measure that was extremely difficult, because they have different ways to address that, to tap into groundwater, to use rivers, what have you. It depends extremely on the assets a company has, on the management in such a mining sector, for instance, and the local circumstances of those mines, for instance. And it's almost impossible then to compare that to other companies or even compare it to similar industries, say the oil industry. So we came to the conclusion that this shouldn't be really the task of the task force, but that we should learn basically from the disclosures over time, and that many organizations will be keen to absorb this information and come up with recommendations for further alignment and convergence, encouraging methods to be applied in the future. It also gives a lot of room for NGOs, civil society to assess the impacts, or assess the reported impacts, and come up with recommendations of how this disclosure should be developed further.
Okay. You mentioned it, there were supplemental guidelines for the financial industry and then for other sectors. What made TCFD choose exactly these 4 sectors? I mean, we all know there are other sectors with a high carbon intensity. How did you define the sectors for the additional sector supplements?
We looked at the carbon intensities of industries and the nature of these industries in the sense of where they are in the chain of emissions, and we structured or categorized, industries in a similar field, upstream, midstream, downstream, and their related emissions. Where we thought that it makes most sense. So there's certainly the strongest element are carbon intensities and the place in the value chain of the usage of fossil fuels. That may not reflect 100% the risk view or the opportunities view, but it was a way to basically structure the 350 different sectors that you normally would see among 5 categories, and come up with recommendations that are applicable and relevant for most of those companies in these categories. So a compromise again.
Okay. We have some more comments, especially from the side of John Moorhead. I would like to add a few to the discussion. For example, John says that this science-based, the SDA, what's that? Maybe you can specify this, is one of 8 models that companies can use to find the science-based approach. You feel the feeling, John, that we should be more generic and not just focus on this approach. What's your opinion on this, Andreas?
Well, I don't really have an opinion from a TCFD perspective, right?
I mean, approach, sorry. Sectoral decarbonization approach.
You're basically asked to look at the 2-degree scenarios in the sense of the carbon emission reduction rate that will imply and cause, and translate that into dimensions and risks and opportunities that are material for you as a specific companies. And the way you want to do that, and the focus, the specific focus differs quite substantially from company to company. So I don't really have a particular view on how exactly you want to do that. More importantly is that you discuss that internally, come up with key assumptions, that you document that and explain why you took these assumptions, and calculate or assess then the impacts on your campus and disclose this information.
Okay, so still quite a lot of technical questions to solve. Now, another more generic question. The recommendations are out now, and they seem to create quite a strong echo. How fast, Andreas, do you think such reporting will become mandatory in one or the other way? And what organization would make it mandatory? Would it be national governments, or would it be a financial disclosure standard that would integrate such criteria? What's your expectation there?
Well, I can only speculate here. I mean, the fact that this is, I think, the biggest initiative that we've ever seen in the sustainability context, and the only one that has been triggered out of a high-level G20 and regulatory environment, gives it a lot of weight. And I think that holds all elements of a game-changing framework in that sense. And I have high hopes that this will have a huge influence on disclosure and that it will get adopted over the next few years. But I have a 5 years horizon, in mind. And it probably will take some time until these guidelines will reach all companies, until everybody is realizing that this is actually the new converging method to comply with. Having that it really depends on also the adoption and also the reaction from related stakeholders, mainly investors. As long as innocent asset managers and big investors do not challenge basically their investee companies on these matters, then I think the adoption may be more difficult. So a lot of question marks comes to how quickly it will be adopted, but I think it's, for me, the most influential, the most important and material initiative that has ever been started in this context.
So, as always, pressure is needed from different sides, be it pressure groups, be it peer pressure as well. I guess once some of the leading organizations of certain sectors will start to report, others will feel the pressure to follow up. So we'll see how this will develop over time. A last question on the TCFD as such. The task is fulfilled, a report is there, it might be amended slightly, and then a final report will be published in June. What happens to TCFD after that? Will it be dissolved?
Good question. We don't know yet, actually. The decision has not been taken finally. I think definitely this first phase of the task force work is finalized. To what extent it will still exist remains to be seen. Idea circle that it would be revived once we would see the first disclosures, and in that sense it could go on, but the decision has not been taken yet. It also depends on who would actually finance that and push it. We have also to recognize that this was also quite a exercise, and has been coordinated by Bloomberg organization, Michael Bloomberg, who invested quite a bit into that. The secretariat was based on Promontory, so also a private sector company. So it was down to who is willing to push that further.
And I can imagine that you yourself, you're not sad if you have this time at your disposal again for other projects within Swiss Re as well. I think we've come to an end. Are there any urgent questions from the audience that you would still like to pose to Andreas? I don't see anything in the chat. So I would like to thank you very much, Andreas, for this useful insight into the report and the process behind it. I would also like to thank all the participants to this webinar. It was our first webinar. I hope we managed to get it across technically well. I hope you understood us well. We're open to get your feedback on it. Just send an email to info@sustainablefinance.ch. I'm sure it won't be our last webinar. We will follow up with other topical questions. Yes, I would like to close this session now, and I wish you all a very nice day. Thank you.